Hi guys, welcome to part 4 of the Vector Eagletree Flight Controller and OSD setup videos that I've been doing. Now in this video we're going to start touching on the OSD. Now I say start touching on it because there is a huge amount to cover and chances are I'm going to have to split it up into at least 2, maybe even 3 videos. For the most part on this particular video I'm going to concentrate purely on the basic setup. I'll show you around the OSD, I'll show you what it can do, some of the attributes that are available in the basic side of things, and a few little features that are worthy of mentioning. So you'll see on the left hand menu you can see what looks like an OSD and someone flying a plane. That isn't in fact that, it's just an A4 piece of paper with a picture on it, and I've got a GoPro with its on-screen display turned off currently pointing at it, just to give you an idea. However, if I pick up my Vector you can see the artificial horizon is moving, and that is just sort of demonstrating what it will look like when you're flying the aircraft. Now the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the display hardware settings, and I will cover all of this in another video, but the main one that we want to look at right now is reverse colour for PAL camera right down the bottom. And basically I am using a PAL system on my GoPro going all the way through to my screen. I would like that not to be reversed because I'm using PAL. I'm going to click apply and you will see on the left hand side that everything that was kind of purple is now green, and that's exactly how I want it. So now let's step into the actual look on the OSD, and what we're going to do is we're going to go to the right hand screen and just take a look at kind of the system that is used to add attributes and move them around. Okay, so you can see at the moment I have got a box highlighted in green. Now basically this is a box where an attribute can be placed. You will see there's 5 at the top, 5 underneath it, then there's another 5 at the bottom and 5 underneath that. So every single one of these spaces are available to put an attribute from the OSD. So that is actually a reading from the vector that you can place in it. Now I have literally got it in the default layout at the moment, and you can see on the left hand screen that a couple of them are actually overlaid over the top of a rather annoying clock. Now that clock is from my DVR, which is recording the output of the OSD. However, it highlights one of the main advantages of the Vector over many other OSD screens. Obviously that's going to be very distracting, it's going to get in the way, we don't really want that to happen. Unfortunately the DVR has no option for turning that off, so that's got to stay there. So what I would love to be able to do is move those attributes out of the way. With this system, if we look at the software screen again, it is literally as easy as dragging and dropping. So I do not want to have my MAH showing in the top right, so I'm just going to grab the box and I'm going to drag it and I'm going to drop it down into the middle. You can see on the left hand screen nothing's happened yet. I'm going to click apply and boom, MAH 69 now shows on the bottom of the screen. I'll discuss a bit more about what that is and what it's doing later on, but for the moment we also don't want this amp rating showing because that's over the top of the clock, so we'll move that out of the way. And we also don't want the main pack voltage showing out of the way. Now actually I'm going to move that to the top left hand screen, so I'm going to place it over the top of this, which is the RSSI, and you'll notice when I drop it the RSSI will now move to the position where it was. I don't want that, so I'm going to drop it there and I'm going to click apply, and if we look at the left hand screen again, boom, all of a sudden the clock is now in view and we haven't got anything that's getting in the way. So that's an immediate effect that the Vector has over some of the other OSDs, is you can actually configure where particular attributes show, whether they show up, how many show on the screen, and there is literally a ton of information that you can have shown on the screen. Again, I'm going to cover a lot of that information and how you can configure it in later videos, and that's where you go into the advanced setting. But that for the moment is just an overview of how you kind of use the grid position and how you can move stuff around. Now one thing that's worth noting with the grid position is that you may see that a lot of these attributes, they're fairly small on the screen. Now again, a great advantage of this OSD is that if you did want just fairly basic information but you wanted it a little bigger, a little bit more prominent, you can choose to use large text for numeric layout readout. So what you do is you click this little tick box and take a look at the grid system, and you'll see on the fake OSD, on the software, you've now only got 1, 2, 3 at the top, 1, 2, 3 at the bottom. However, when I click apply, you will see that now on the actual OSD on the left hand side, all of these attributes are showing up in much larger, much easier to read format. And again, this is a really nice feature. Now you can see that actually my home arrow is getting over that clock again, so I'm not going to want that there. I'm going to drag it down, I'm going to click apply, and boom, that's now out of the way. So again, if you wanted to have a nice simple OSD with just your basic information, say for example your voltage, current voltage of your pack, maybe the MAH that you've used from your pack, maybe the number of satellites and your RSSI, then having it in large format is absolutely perfect, especially if you've got a widescreen camera setup like a GoPro where you've got some nice black bars that will really make it easy to be able to see what you're doing whilst you're flying. Okay, so now what we'll look at is some of the attributes themselves. Now I'm going to turn this back to the small version, so we've got a little bit more space. So I'm going to click apply there. Okay, so some of the basic attributes, and for this I would say get your manual out, have a read of them. I will touch on a few of them, I'm not going to touch on all of them. There's a huge amount to cover and some of them are very straightforward and fairly obvious for what they do. When we look at the electrical side of things, at the moment we've got pack voltages showing. If I wanted to have the current amps showing again, and it was before, I'm just going to click on this and you'll see amp draw is currently now up there on the screen. If I want to show it on the actual OSD, I click apply and there we go. So we can see at the moment my system is drawing about 0.3 amps currently. If I had a motor and I was running at cruise speed, obviously that would be a much higher figure, but this is a nice way of knowing whether or not you're over pulling from your motor, your ESC, whether you're working it too hard, especially if you want to be trying a few prop configurations to see if you can get the maximum efficiency out of it. Bear in mind, of course, when you give it a bootful, that amp draw is going to go shooting up because you're going to be drawing a lot more amps, but that's fairly basic information and most people who have set up an aircraft will know that's the situation. The other option you've got here is pack MAH used. Now if I click on that and click apply, and I'll move that into a place where we can see it a bit better. There we go. So that's telling me that MAH used so far is 91. Now that is to say that's 91 milliamp hours of the pack used since I turned the Vector on. I've been faffing around doing a bit of setup, which is why I've started using it, but again, that will give you an indication of how many MAH you've actually used from your pack. Now underneath that you'll notice there's the figure 2200. Now that is of course the amount of MAH in my battery. This is completely configurable by you and this is something that you do when you actually do the initial setup, the kind of the pre-flight checks. You make sure that you've got the right MAH in your battery, you make sure the Vector knows it, and then it will count down and it will use that information for the various gauges and dials that you can then configure. You can sort of say you can have a battery gauge that goes from green to yellow to red, and again we'll cover all of that in the advanced OSD settings. So underneath that you can see that there is transmitter voltage and receiver voltage. Now you might ask yourself, well, why do we want both of those? Well, transmitter voltage is very handy if you've got a second battery that's purely powering your transmitter pack, your video transmitter. Of course you don't want to have a brownout because your battery dies on your video transmitter, so this is an excellent way of knowing what kind of voltage you've got left in that transmitter. And again, in the advanced attributes you can set alarms and warnings that go off to actually tell you that you're getting a little bit low on all of that. Moving down the list slightly, you can see at the moment we've got home arrow is ticked on. Now currently, because I have no GPS, there is a question mark next to my home. You can see, however, on the system display here that there is a red arrow. Now basically the way that the home arrow works is a little bit confusing in my opinion. When that arrow is pointing upwards, that means the aircraft is flying towards the home point. So somewhat bizarrely, when you're flying back towards you, it's going to be facing up. When you're going away from you, it's going to be facing down. Now that will always depend on whether you're using the magnetic compass. If you are, it will be a lot more accurate because it knows when the plane is yawing around, when it's actually coming around to face you. Otherwise what it will do is a GPS plot, and obviously a GPS plot requires it to be moving through the air and taking measurements as it goes as to where it is, so it won't be quite as quick and accurate to actually change. So just bear that in mind when you're using the home arrow. Underneath that you can see we've got some fairly straightforward obvious settings. We've got the barometric altitude that will actually use the barometer that's inside the Vector, GPS altitude using the GPS device, The show absolute GPS altitude, again, that's kind of a further setting for it. And all of these settings, again, have a read of the manual. If you don't know what's going on with it, go to the forums, ask the question. There's plenty of people who use a lot more of these attributes than I ever will, who will be able to answer some of these questions probably a little bit better than I can. The main ones that I would point out on here are distance to pilot and cumulative distance. Now, distance to pilot is a fairly obvious one. Imagine a straight line going from you to the aircraft. That's how that works. Cumulative distance is quite a good one because that tells you the amount of distance covered by the aircraft in that single flight. So let's say you fly a kilometre away from you and then you fly a kilometre back. It's going to be a cumulative distance of 2 kilometres. Now that's really nice if you want to do a long range flight but you need to do some testing. What you do is you get your plane up in the air, you use the cumulative distance, and you can basically work out under certain conditions how far your plane will fly before the pack is drained, and it's a real world reading of that, so you can do that without having to fly it miles and miles away, and you can get that indication. Now underneath that we've got some miscellaneous. We've got GPS course, that will tell you kind of the course that it's been plotting. Temperature sensor if you've got a temperature sensor. Flight time remaining, that one will use the MAH left in your pack and the current amp draw. Now you've got to be careful when using something like this because it is a calculation based on the current amp draw at the time. Now if you're doing stunt flying and you're going up and you're going down, and you're throttling up and you're going and throttling down, it's not going to be very accurate because it can only go from the current amp rating. Ideally, this is suited to people who have just got a nice cruise speed, get it into a cruise speed, say 50% throttle, 40% throttle, get it into that, get the amps fairly consistent over, say, 30 seconds to a minute, and that's going to give you a much more accurate idea of how long your pack has got and how long your flight time is going to be to remain. Personally, I would always err on the side of caution with this and go with the actual voltage more than anything. Under that we've got receiver RSSI and GPS satellite count, both fairly obvious. RSSI obviously will depend on your transmitter and your receiver as to what information actually comes back from it. I'm currently got 100% RSSI. Number one, I'm sat right next to the transmitter, and of course number two, I've got a Futaba which isn't giving me 100% accurate RSSI feed. If you're using something like Easy UHF, which I will be at some point, that's going to be a much more accurate kind of indication, which will go up and down in single percents rather than kind of 25, 50, 100. Moving over to the left hand side, we've got the option to use English or metric. Now that was already set up in part 1 of my videos under the system settings. However, you do have the ability of overriding the system settings. So if you are using a metric reading for nearly everything, you can say, well, I want to have a metric set up, but actually I would like to have miles per hour instead of kilometers per hour. So it's just a handy little feature. If you want to chop and change, you can do that. Show units on screen, that is to say whether or not there's miles per hour shown on screen. If I click on that, you can see volts is now showing under MAH. I'll just do an apply so you can see it on the left hand side. RSI has now got a percentage next to it. MAH has got some tiny little words and writing next to it, and again it may be useful as long as you know what they are. Then really it's something that's just going to take up a little bit more screen space. Okay, so now we'll go down to the artificial horizon, and we've got the simple one, which is just a couple of lines, which, as I've done before, if we look on the left hand screen, if I move the vector around, we get some movement. If we wanted to have a bit more elaborate, I could go for the F-16 style, and now when I pick it up, we've got a much more interesting ladder effect in the center. Again, personal preference, I will not be using anything more than the simple AHI. Underneath we've got ladders, speed and altitude. You can see on the left hand side and the right hand side there are two gauges. If I just remove them, I'll remove the speed. Left hand gauge has now disappeared. If I wanted to remove the altitude, and again now I've got a little bit more clear space. Obviously again it totally depends on whether you're doing it. Speed, you can see if you have the pitot tube, which is an optional and extra, you can use the speed from the pitot tube to measure real air speed, which is quite handy in some circumstances. Now, the one below this is quite an interesting one. It defaults as being on, but for some reason it doesn't actually show as being on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it off, and I'm going to turn it back on, and you can see on the software setup a gauge is turned up. I'm going to click apply, and sure enough there's a gauge that's turned up on the right hand side. Now be very careful with what this gauge actually does. This is main pack MAH gauge. Now what this is doing is this is taking the current MAH used, so at the moment it's showing 134 of the 2200, and that is the gauge. So that gauge, as that number counts up, that gauge will go down. It is not using the voltage for the gauge. That is done on a separate advanced menu, and it's something that can be quite confusing. So just bear this in mind. It's a good indication, but of course you need to remember, if you've got a 2200 milliamp hour battery and you put in 2200 milliamp hours, when that gauge gets to 0, you have nothing. You've killed your LiPo completely. Really what you want to be doing is you want to be setting that figure around the 80% mark, and then you know when that gauge gets to 0, that's the time when you're really digging into it. That's kind of your emergency bingo fuel, as it were. But again, just bear in mind that that gauge there, when you do select it, is not doing based on voltage. It's doing it based on the milliamp hours left in the pack, so just bear that in mind. So underneath that we've got other readouts to display. We've got the radar, which is currently centered on home. Now this is something that can get a bit confusing, and it looks as if I've got enough GPS signal to at least demonstrate it slightly. A little bit hard to see. I'm just going to turn off the heads up display and click apply. And unfortunately that will only be there if we have that on, and that's disappeared. Okay, basically what the radar centered on, this is, oh no, it's back now. You can't see it very well, but there's a tiny little chevron in the center of the screen now on the actual OSD. Now the way that the radar works is, in its current setting with radar centered on home, what that means, and if you look at the screen on the right now, this circle is home, as if you were staring from Google Earth or a satellite staring right down on your head. So right in the center of that circle is your head. You then get that tiny little chevron, which is currently barely even visible on the left hand screen, right in the middle of it. That chevron is your aircraft, and that aircraft will be pointing in the direction that you're flying it. So if you fly it north away from you, it's going to be pointing north, and the further you go away from you, the further away it will go from that center spot. So you'll see this little chevron moving away from you. It gets a little bit distracting potentially. It may not be for everyone, but what you can do, as long as you understand that when that chevron turns around and comes back to point at you and heads towards the center circle, that means the plane's coming back to you. So that is probably, in my opinion, the best way of dealing with the radar on. The alternative is that you choose the model method, so radar centered on model. Now what that means is the center circle here is no longer you, it's the model, and the chevron is you. So you need to then bear in mind where you're flying to it. Now, as all of these will require the magnetic compass, what you need to do is you need to set the number of degrees that you were off from north before you fly it. So again, do some reading up on this. Just don't rely on it. The home arrow is a very good way of doing it, and don't forget, of course, you've got return to home feature as well, which is another option. You can also set a radius to this, so if you have 5,000 feet, then you know that the limits of your screen will be 5,000 feet away, so it gives you a kind of an accurate idea of how close to the edge of your maximum distance that you want to fly away from is before you actually leave that area. After that, we've got graphical compass. Now that is the east and south, or as it is on the left hand side, west and north showing. If I turn that off and click apply, there you go, that's disappeared completely. I'll turn it back on. And at the moment we've got home stroke center screen. That is the home center screen, which is the circle. I'll just turn that off and you'll see the circle disappears completely. Turn it back on. And that's the home point. You saw probably the chevron just flash up a moment there. Now underneath this is quite a good one as well if you use a DVR. Show GPS position. Now at the moment it's set to never, and sometimes because I'm indoors this does give me a little bit of a problem. If I set it to always, on the right hand screen you can see some latitude and longitude has now appeared. I'll just click apply, and yet we've got enough signal to pull that through, so that is now pulling through on the OSD. Now the reason that that's quite useful is because while it does take up a bit of screen space, if you're flying a long range flight and you've got a DVR that's recording your flight from your ground station, and all of a sudden your plane gets into trouble, or you brown out or you go down, you will be able to replay the DVR footage and you'll be able to see what the last coordinates were. Now, if you're flying within line of sight, it's not going to be an issue, you'll be able to see it, but if you're flying far away, this will at least give you an indication of where to start looking. And if you've got tracking devices like Bluetooth tracking devices that can only go up to sort of 50 meters away, you'll know at least get to that spot, get to those coordinates using your GPS, and then you can start hunting around for your plane on the hope that it hasn't cruised off for miles and miles and miles. But the good thing with this, you don't have to have it always on taking up screen space. You can actually choose Trouble, which will activate if you're in return to home mode. You can choose low altitude, so if you go below a certain altitude, then it will kick in and you will actually see the GPS displayed then. You can also say if you go a set distance away that you can have it on, or you can have it on all the time, or of course you can have it on never. So if I turn that off, we say never. Now again, bear in mind that these are options that you can set in the advanced screen, which I will cover in a later video, but this will give you the ability of at least setting these from this point if you want to have them always on. It's not a bad thing to do. Flight mode indicator, you can see on the left hand screen there is 2D written, and on the right hand screen 2DH, as it's just a demonstration. If I were to flip my mode switch into the second position, that is basically mimicking the top position, so nothing should happen. Now I click that, there we go, a little flash up saying 2D no hold enable. Now my center position of my submenu switch should be 2D hold enabled, so if I click that, there we go. Oh, in fact, yeah, I put it as loiter mode, so we can see now I've gone into loiter mode. I've also got a third position which is return to home, but I'm not going to flick that yet because that will give me an audio warning, and I want to discuss audio warnings in a later video. What I'll do is I'll throw the main mode switch into the bottom mode, and you can see now it says off. So that is literally your flight mode indicator. If you want to have that on, tick it. If you don't, tick it off. Flight timer is kind of a recreation of the flight time remaining, but the flight timer will actually tell you how long you've been flying as opposed to how long you've got remaining for it. And then show flight summary. Now what this is once you've landed the aircraft, once you've powered down, afterwards it will actually show you a summary of all the various settings that you've been displaying. So your maximum distances, your minimum distances, how far away you got, your cumulative distance. Again, if you've got a DVR, that can be really handy because it will record the information on your DVR before you turn everything off, and then you can take it back and you can actually read it. Also bear in mind that the Vector has a built-in log, and it records every single thing that you do pretty much, and again data logging and everything like that is something that I'm going to cover in a later video because that gets to the advanced stages. Finally, let's just have a look at the alarms. Now again, alarms, that's something that I'm going to touch on again. I keep saying it in the advanced menus, but there are alarms that can either flash up on screen, change colours, or if you've got your audio inputs put in, they will actually speak to you. So if I said I wanted to have an alarm that sets off when my pack voltage falls below 3.5 volts per cell with no load, I could also choose to not only have that so it flashes on the attribute, but I can also say speak the value of these selected parameters on alarm. And basically what that means is that when the alarm sounds, if you've got your audio input set up and you've got a speaker in either your monitor or you've got a set of headphones, you will get that audio voice. It's a male voice that will tell you alarm, alarm, or something like that. And again, I'll do a demonstration of that. I have it all set up ready to go like that, but I'll do a demonstration with a microphone close enough to the speaker so you can really hear it. Other alarms that you can see here just on the basic side of things: transmitter voltage falls below, milliamp hours remaining falls below, all fairly obvious ones. If you're using the barometric altimeter, you can say, you know, if you go below a certain altitude or above a certain altitude, and also you can also say distance to pilot goes beyond, so if you get out of range then it will give you a warning. So that pretty much covers the basics of the OSD, and for most people this is the only screen you're ever going to need to know because you've got loads of options here. You've got everything that you need to be able to fly your plane, and more importantly you can chop and change the stuff that you can see depending on the type of flight you've got. So if I do all of this again, I can move it around. However, when we move on to the advanced features, you can change the colours, you can change the number of colours in a warning gauge, you can change when warnings kick off, you can change what milliamp hours red forms on the gauge, you can kind of set audio alarms, you can do so many different things that it really deserves another video. So I'm going to leave it for that at the moment. Hopefully that lets people know the basics of it. Again, all of these attributes, they're all in the manual. Read up on them. If you don't get the information that you want, go onto RC groups. There's already a thread on there. I'll put the link in the bottom of this video, and then ask the people who have been using this for the last 6 months. I haven't been using this. I still haven't flown this. I'm not professing to be an expert, but I felt it deserved someone just going on here and giving a bit of a demonstration of it, if nothing else, for people who are considering to buy the product. I think it's a useful thing for people to be able to see why the Vector looks like a really good option for a flight control system and OSD.